Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Berkeley Valley Research Center seminar series. I'm hosting today from the traditional territory of the Gidim clan of the Wet'suwet'en Nation. I'd like to acknowledge their unceded territory and long-time historical living in this area. We're really pleased to welcome Winnie Kessler today to be our speaker. It's a thrill to have her and to have her career perspectives as well as perspective of change over time in wildlife research. I'd like to take a couple of minutes to acknowledge our funders. Thanks go out to the Berkeley Valley Credit Union, the Berkeley Valley Community Foundation, and the Province of BC Gaming Funds that help support and make these seminars and our workshops possible. And I'd also like to thank all of you who are members. Your memberships to the center also help make these seminars possible. And yeah, we really enjoy having them. And it's been great to move into them virtually because more people can participate and we can hear from a wider variety of presenters also. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Dawn Hansen. I'm the Executive Director of the Berkeley Valley Research Center, and I'm super pleased to host today. So a little bit about Winnie. Dr. Kessler will reflect today on her 45-year wildlife science and management career. She studied at Berkeley and Texas, and then researched for many years at University of Idaho. A little bit more closer to home, she became the founding chair of UNBC's Forestry program. She has 21 years experience with the U.S. Forest Service in Alaska, National Wildlife Ecologist. She has been involved with Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation and on the National Board of Directors on Ducks Unlimited. In 2019, she was elected to the board of the Canadian Wildlife Federation. Throughout her career, Dr. Kessler has been the first woman in every position she has held, a true pioneer. And most recently, on the more fun side, she traveled to Panama and went to this amazing cloud observatory and then to several wildlife and canal museums. And it just sounds like an amazing trip. We're so thrilled to have you here today, Winnie. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. And I caught COVID on the way back from Panama, so excuse me if my throat is a bit scratchy. So thank you for this opportunity. I haven't been able to address the center since years ago in person. So thank goodness we have this remote capability now. I'm going to go into my talk and just kind of reduce, my picture there. Okay, so first I want to provide some background on this presentation. In 2017, I was shocked to be announced as that year's recipient of the Aldo Leopold Memorial Award, because this is the highest award bestowed by the Wildlife Society, which is the International Science and Professional Organization for the wildlife field. And it's kind of a lifetime achievement award based on your contributions over your career. And in this award's 80-year history, I was only the second woman to get it. The first being Dr. Lucille Stickle, who is the pioneer of wildlife toxicology. So it was about time, but I do know one thing, going ahead, we're going to see a lot more women getting this award because there are just so many amazing women in the pipeline today. Now, this award has a couple of strings attached, I guess you could say, a couple of traditions. One is that the recipient provides the keynote address at the following Wildlife Society annual conference. And also that they publish that keynote address in the Wildlifer. And it's kind of expected that the keynote will share perspectives gained over one's career. That's kind of what this award's about. So to prepare for this presentation, I went to my beloved books by Aldo Leopold and about him. And it reminded me why we hold him in such regard. And it reminded me of the enormous influence he's had on our thinking about the natural world. Leopold wrote many kinds of things, from the first ever textbook on wildlife management to policy documents, to research papers, to management notes. But especially touching are his essays that share his wisdom gained through personal observation and deep reflection. I'll suggest that the most timeless of these is his land ethic, which gives us an ecological understanding of our place in the natural world. And it gives us a moral compass for living in harmony with it. So that kind of got my juices flowing. And once I had reacquainted myself with Leopold, I took a deep look at my own career, which has been wonderful. It's not been typical. I'm not sure there is such a thing. I've seen much change in our profession. I've worked with awesome people, seen great advances in the science of wildlife management, celebrated victories in conservation, and mourned the losses. And like Leopold, I found that important lessons sometimes come from mundane events that trigger deep reflection. Perhaps Leopold's best example is his encounter with an old wolf he'd shot, as described in his essay, Thinking Like a Mountain. He had shot piles of wolves over the years in the name of predator control, but something in the fierce green fire dying in her eyes moved him towards a whole new way of thinking about predators and their management. This talk shares a few of my own dying wolf moments that have yielded insight about the field of wildlife conservation and about my own personal role in it. I hope there's some useful lessons that you might find of value in your own careers. Well, my story begins here in San Francisco, where I was born and raised. I was a true urban kid, since my family did not own a car to go outside the city. But we lived in a perfect spot to fuel an interest in nature. We were across the street from Golden Gate Park, a block away from the Pacific Ocean, and within cruising range were the California Academy of Science with its amazing wildlife collections, and the San Francisco Zoo. Those were my hangouts when I was a kid, and they inspired me to major in zoology at the University of California at Berkeley, even though I had absolutely no clue what one would do with such a degree. Luckily, I met a professor in the forestry school, A. Starker Leopold, and yes, he is the son of Aldo Leopold. And he explained about wildlife management and what I'd need to pursue that field. Here's an old photo, picture of Dr. Leopold preparing a mole specimen, and that keener climbing in for a better look up in the upper left there. That's the very young me. I was inspired by Dr. Leopold and started attending seminars in the forestry school, usually the only woman in the room. One Friday afternoon, I felt bold enough to attend the post-seminar gathering at the local tavern. The seminar speaker, a United Nations official visiting from Rome, stopped in mid-sentence when I walked in, and he declared in a most annoyed tone, "Young woman, do you belong here?" I froze. You could call it a real deer in the headlights moment for me, and I was just about ready to turn tail and run away. Thank goodness a professor spoke up and said, "Oh yeah, she's one of ours. Here's a chair." This became a dying wolf moment for me as I reflected on how close I'd come to ending my pursuit of a wildlife career, right then and right there. I came to realize that nobody, not that United Nations guy or anybody else, has the right to say who does or does not belong. If somebody is willing to work their way along the challenging path that leads to this profession, then nobody has the right to discourage their career plans. And this was a really important revelation because, as Dawn mentioned, I would be the first woman in every position that I would hold. It's an important lesson for everybody because we all have preconceived notions about who fits and who doesn't. I recall many years ago finding out that our new fisheries biologist had cerebral palsy that affected his speech and his walking. I'm embarrassed now to say that my initial reaction was, well, how's this going to work? But it turned out the only hard thing about it was seeing how others, acting on their own biases, constantly underestimated his abilities. I learned an important lesson that those who face the greatest challenges in their lives can be the strongest members of the team. For example, Joe Meade, one of the most visionary forest supervisors I've had the privilege to work with. He taught me that sight and vision are two different things. And when it came to managing America's second largest national forest, the Chugach National Forest, vision is really what mattered. Joe had lost his sight as a teenager, and it didn't slow him down for a minute in becoming one of the most effective leaders I've known in our field. Now, here's another lesson from the United Nations Sky incident that I hope you'll take to heart. Every one of us can be that professor who said, hey, she's one of ours. Here's a seat at the table. A simple, inclusive gesture from you at just the right time can make a huge difference in the lives and careers of others. Getting back to Dr. Leopold, Starker Leopold, he did not discourage me from going into the wildlife profession, but he was very honest, pointing out that my zoology background was sorely lacking in ecology and habitat management. So I followed his advice and commenced a master's program at Berkeley with range ecologist Harold Hetty. All three graduate students Dr. Hetty accepted that year were women, the first in the range program's history. They called us Hetty's harem. Now, I know you find that tacky, probably offensive, but I share it so you won't miss the real importance, the real lesson in what Dr. Hetty did, which was ahead of its time. We now know from research why efforts to add diversity sometimes fail. When an organization hires only one or two, quote, different people, they often leave. Or if they do stay, they strive to blend in and not be different, which of course defeats the whole purpose of diversity. Studies suggest that a critical mass of around 15% is required before diversity hires feel empowered to be themselves and begin to change the culture. Now, Dr. Hetty did not have the benefit of that research, but his gut told him that if he took me on, he should take on additional women, kind of a team. And I'm sure that was a big factor in all three of us succeeding, that plus Dr. Hetty being a first-rate ecologist. Also, while Berkeley, I had the fortune to work as a research assistant with Dr. Harold Biswell, or Harry the Torch, as we students fondly called him. A pioneer in fire ecology, he understood fire as an essential renewal force in California's forest and rangeland ecosystems. But in those days, fire was the enemy. The agencies tolerated no wildfires and certainly not prescribed burning. For years, Dr. Biswell was banned from doing research on public land and worked instead on private properties. One dying wolf moment occurred at a public meeting organized by the US Forest Service to discuss fire policy. Likely the speakers did not know that Dr. Biswell and Mrs. Biswell were in the audience when they rudely dismissed him as a raging pyromaniac. This was a very awkward moment, but it caused me to reflect deeply on Dr. Biswell's perseverance and commitment, and how, shunned in most circles, he poured everything into his graduate students and research assistants. And it was a very good strategy, because those graduates would end up in top agency and academic slots and shape fire policy for many, many decades. Dr. Biswell lived to be vindicated, as his many predictions and warnings about wildfire came to pass. I thought of him in December 2017 as the Thomas Fire ripped through Southern California, where under Dr. Biswell's guidance, I had done research on fire in Chaparral. That little green oasis in the blackened landscape is my brother's home in Ventura County. He had lost his first home on this site during the Wheeler Canyon Fire of 1985. After that experience, and with considerable prodding by me, based on my Chaparral work with Dr. Biswell, he took fire landscaping to heart and was the only one in the neighborhood whose home survived the Thompson Fire. In addition to the cutting-edge ecology I gained from Dr. Biswell, there was a vivid lesson about courage in science. Like many, I had sort of figured that university tenure was mostly about job security following a probationary period as a new professor. But working with Dr. Biswell showed me that the essential role of tenure is to protect those who are doing unpopular or controversial research. Berkeley administrators were under heavy pressure to fire Dr. Biswell, but they respected and defended his tenured status. Sometimes it takes courage to do the research that needs doing, speak the truth, and advocate for science-based policies. Many of my colleagues are in this situation today, and I expect some of you are, or if not, you will be in some point in your career. Aldo Leopold wrote about this in his time, but there is a critical difference today. While we may live in a world of wounds, we are no longer alone. So I would urge you to draw from the strength of your colleagues, and in the bad times, remember that this too shall pass. My fire ecology background was key in my next career move, pursuing a PhD with Dr. Jimmy Dodd at Texas A&M University on the endangered Atwater's prairie chicken. Texas A&M had gone co-ed only 4 years before I got there, and Dr. Dodd took immense flack for accepting a woman into the program, and from radical Berkeley, no less. But vindication was sweet some years later in 2004, when Texas A&M invited me back to receive an Outstanding Alumnus Award. And I was so glad to share this honor with Dr. Dodd before his passing. But backing up now to my arrival at Texas A&M. The Atwater's prairie chicken came with an interesting challenge. The Endangered Species Act of 1973 had just passed, and it had a new requirement for permits for those who wanted to work on listed species. But there were no application forms or procedures in place yet. We'd be among the first to apply. Dr. Dodd assigned me to the task, and I began by reading just what was prohibited under the law that one might need a permit for. So the law prohibits the take of listed species, and it has a number of things that constitute take. Well, ours would be a habitat study, so we wouldn't be capturing, killing, or wounding birds. The Texas Wildlife Department was doing the telemetry portion of the research, so they would have to worry about those kinds of things. However, I did plan to do a companion study of the mating behavior of these birds on their communal leks. Well, I did my best to cobble up an application, and when the permit arrived, Dr. Dodd was kind of beside himself with laughter, because the permit authorized us to harass the Atwater's prairie chicken, making him feel somewhat like a pervert, but he kept that permit on his wall for many, many years after I left the program. Now, the term restoration ecology, we all know what that is, but it didn't exist in 1973. But that, in fact, was what the project was. By the late 1930s, Atwater prairie chicken populations had declined to a few small pockets, and it was fully expected that they would go the way of the heath hen, which died out as a subspecies in 1933. The Atwater prairie chicken required Texas tallgrass prairie, but most of that had been converted to rice fields and other agriculture. So a little fledgling group named the Nature Conservancy got together with another little fledgling group called the World Wildlife Fund. And this would have been in the late 1930s. They bought a piece of land in Texas coastal prairie. They fenced it. They kicked out people and cattle so it could be protected for the Atwater prairie chicken. But the problem is the prairie chickens did not thrive because the prairie did not thrive under such protection. As we know now, native prairie requires disturbance, such as periodic burning or the trampling by millions of bison feet. So this little piece of habitat was being protected to death, and its value for Atwater's chickens was being lost as it was invaded by brush and weedy species. About the time I came onto the project in 1973, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service acquired this property and established the Atwater Prairie Chicken National Wildlife Refuge. Our project tested the refuge's response to fire, cattle grazing, and other treatments. We found that fire worked very well. And ever since then, the refuge has done prescribed burning on a regular basis to maintain the prairie. So in that respect, the work was a success. However, today at the refuge, you will see robust prairie, and you're going to see many, many wildlife species, but you're not going to see Atwater's prairie chicken unless you happen to be there when they release some of the captively bred ones. Back in the 1970s, it was optimistically thought that little pockets of habitat might be enough to sustain populations. Of course, now we better understand how vulnerable populations, when isolated, are prone to winking out. Now, for me, a key lesson from the Atwater's experience was that restoring remnant habitats is too little, too late. Wildlife survival can be much better secured by getting out in front to prevent the loss and degradation of its habitat. And that revelation put me firmly on the path of habitat ecology and management. After graduating from Texas A&M, I became a wildlife faculty member at the University of Idaho's College of Natural Resources. And soon I experienced a dying wolf moment that triggered further reflection about my chosen profession. It happened at a Wildlife Society conference in Alaska, where I'd gone to report my research findings on Alaska birds and forest management. This would have been around 1978. A speaker before me wrapped up his talk on shorebird research and invited questions. The first question was, How might your findings be used in bird conservation or coastal management? The presenter looked baffled, kind of hung his head for half a minute or so, and then said, I don't have a clue and I don't care. Next question. I was floored. The more I revisited that moment, the more upset I got. Certainly, society needs basic research that may not have immediate application, but there are appropriate employers and funding sources for people who want to do basic research. This biologist worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, an agency with a clear conservation mission and countless problems that needed solving. How could he not care if his publicly funded research ever got applied for the good of wildlife and society? As angry as I was at this biologist, he did me a real favor by stimulating deep reflection about what mattered in my own career pathway. I discovered that my real passion was for applying science to problems. It didn't matter whether I did the research or somebody else. The important thing was putting science to use. Finding solutions is what mattered, at least to me and to the resource, I believe. So my next jobs provided ample opportunity to pursue that passion of putting science to practical use. In the early 1980s, the US Forest Service hired me as the first ever regional wildlife ecologist for the Alaska region, working mostly in the amazing coastal rainforests of Alaska, where I had been doing research on bird communities for several years. So this is a picture of coastal Alaska, and on the left is the Chugach National Forest, which is managed primarily for wildlife and recreation. And the other national forest, and I'll mention these are the two largest national forests in the US system. The other one is the Tongass National Forest, and as you know, it's sort of an extension of BC's coastal forest. But management was completely different on the Tongass. At that time, the infamous 50-year timber contracts were in full sway, and huge swaths were being clear-cut. The logs were taken to saltwater and shipped off to markets in China and Japan. Now, these contracts, thankfully, would be done away with in the early 90s. But back in the 80s, when I was working there, that's what we had to deal with. And the job that, our job was to be habitat enhancement. We're supposed to somehow go in these landscapes that were being clear cut and, quote, enhance habitat. And that notion was based on forests in the lower 48, where forestry was shown, you know, if small clear cuts, openings, were shown to increase the abundance of deer, quail, turkey, and other wildlife, creating lots of edge. That was kind of the belief in the dogma at the time, as exemplified in this little propaganda ad here. But it was obvious to the wildlife ecologists working in Southeast Alaska that it didn't fit that model. Based on the research I'd done on birds and the research of others on Sitka black-tailed deer, brown bears, goshawks, and more, old growth was the optimal habitat and could not be improved upon. To manage for wildlife, you needed to keep old growth habitats intact. You all know that from where you are. But it was a new thought at the time, and it wasn't limited to Alaska. The same was being found for the spotted owl and the marbled murrelet in the Pacific Northwest, the goshawk in the Southwest, and so on. Also, what was coming to light was the importance of managing for species diversity rather than single species. This notion was gaining traction. And along with that came the need for management to begin applying in earnest the principles and findings of ecosystem science. Now, in 1986, the Forest Service promoted me to National Wildlife Ecologist. So I worked across the entire national forest system. So everything green on that map, and the kind of buff colored ones are the national grasslands also administered as part of the system. You can kind of think of these, they're kind of like crown lands in that they're public lands, but they're administered by the federal government, and they are covered by some very, very robust environmental laws, including important provisions for wildlife and biodiversity. So I got to work with researchers, wildlife biologists, and forest managers in ecosystems throughout the US and overseas as well, in such interesting places as India and Mongolia. The mission of my position and the role I played was to work to improve the science basis for managing wildlife habitats. Now, this was in the period in the late 1980s, early 90s, that the Forest Service was under immense pressure to abandon its traditional sustained yield program and model that regarded timber, wildlife, and other resources as, quote, competing outputs dealt with by separate disciplines. This period image kind of captures the thinking of the day that was under challenge, that it was just a business of competing flows of outputs. The agency was changing to a new paradigm that recognized forests and rangelands as complex ecological systems that required a lot of careful thought in the application of ecosystem science. So this is a period poster from that time that it's quite a different concept for looking at these public lands. Now, philosophically, this change was a needed shift to Aldo Leopold's land ethic. And scientifically, it called for much more complex principles and approaches that had been applied under the old agricultural model. Today, these principles and concepts are a lot more familiar to us, but at that time, we pretty much had to figure them out. So somewhat reluctantly, I agreed to move to the Washington, DC headquarters to work with colleagues on this transition to what would become ecosystem-based management. So we worked on these principles, but the real challenge was, how do you apply them in actual forest management? Thankfully, we had some really good leadership at the time, and these principles began to enter the mainstream of public land management. And in witnessing that change, I was very happy to see it actually starting to play out on the landscape, both home and abroad. What it taught me was the extreme complexity of the management problems that involve land and wildlife and people. And of course, that's all of them. I got an appreciation that there's simply no way that any one discipline can get its arms around such problems. It takes teams of people from different disciplines working together in a coordinated and cooperative manner. And yet I realized this was not the way students were being trained in the stovepiped wildlife, forestry, range, and other natural resource programs. Around this time, I became a vocal critic of natural resource education because of this stovepipe approach. It just wasn't producing the perspective and the abilities that are needed to practice ecosystem-based management. Well, in 1993, an opportunity arose to put my money where my mouth was, so to speak, when I was recruited to BC to develop and chair the new natural resource program at UNBC, which at that time was under construction in Prince George. the challenge laid out to me by the administrators was to develop an integrated approach to natural resource education and to supply the North with competent graduates in wildlife, forestry, and other fields. Well, I must confess that building a new natural resource program from scratch, and a uniquely integrated one, was the hardest job I've ever faced in my career. It's also the thing I'm proudest of. But at the time, my question was, oh my God, where do we start? If ever I needed a dying wolf moment to point the way, that was it. Luckily, that dying wolf moment came at a conference in Toronto in a talk by the late Ursula Franklin. She provided the breakthrough I needed in her simple definition of a professional as a citizen with a toolbox. In Dr. Franklin's view, educators in professional fields put way too much emphasis on the toolbox, which contains the methods, the technology of professional practice. She argued that insufficient attention is given to the development of citizens within that profession. I realized that this disparity had major implications for the natural resource fields. Science and technology provide our profession with powerful tools, but the traditional approach in natural resource education was simply to increase the tools in the toolbox by loading curricula with more and more specialized classes. But just as important is the responsible use of those tools, which is where the citizen part comes in. These ideas echoed the wisdom that Aldo Leopold shared in his own writings on education. The lesson from him and from Ursula Franklin is that we can add all kinds of specialized new courses to the curriculum, but still miss the meat entirely. So at UNBC, we set out to build those underpinnings, to put into the curriculum as integral parts, ethics, collaborative problem solving, integrated perspectives, social responsibility, and so on. It was around this time, in 1994, I delivered the plenary talk on education at the Wildlife Society annual conference and followed up with an article, an education article for the Wildlife Society Bulletin. And in that article, I called for ours to be more than a profession of specialists and scientists and practitioners. Instead, we must strive to be and develop citizen wildlifers, well-trained biologists who help frame society's questions, actively participate in the communities to which they belong, and use their knowledge and tools responsibly to make a better world for wildlife and people. A key role of educators, I suggested, is to encourage development of qualities that citizen wildlifers need to complement the knowledge and skills in their toolbox. They need to be effective problem solvers on behalf of land, wildlife, and people. I believe that to this day, and that the late Gretchen Scott got it right when she wrote, "What formal schooling at its best has done is to prepare me for a living, not earning a living, but living a life." And I'll suggest that in our case, it's a life in service of the natural world. Okay, for my final message, I'm gonna circle back to my starting point when I explained how time spent at a big city zoo and a science museum pointed me on my career path. Well, it turns out I'm far from alone. Take, for example, 3 of the scientists that I admire most. Dr. Anne Innes-Stagg, giraffe expert and renowned Canadian zoologist, did the first field studies of giraffe in Africa during the 1950s, alone and against great odds. According to Dr. Dagg, it all began at age 3 when she saw her first giraffe on a trip to the Brookfield Zoo. That set her path, and she's never wavered, literally writing the book on giraffe ecology and behavior. It was similar for the late Dr. Eugenie Clark, the famous shark lady who pioneered the use of scuba gear in her amazing career as a research ichthyologist. Her widowed mother had to work on many Saturdays and would drop the young Eugenie off at the New York City Aquarium. And that is how she became hooked on marine biology. It was a tough path being a woman in a man's field and of Japanese heritage to boot. But the spark ignited on those aquarium visits never dimmed. And now my favorite scientist of all, Dr. Neil Degrasse Tyson, brilliant astrophysicist and science communicator extraordinaire. Raised in the Bronx, his path was set at age 9 on a visit to the Hayden Planetarium at the Rose Center for Earth and Space in New York City. He says that from that point on, quote, I had no choice in the matter, that in fact, the universe called me. Since 1996, he has been the director of the very Hayden Planetarium that sparked his initial passion. And of course, the host of my very favorite podcast, Star Talk. I share these examples in hopes that you may take a couple of lessons to heart. First, all 3 of these scientists had to defy prejudices and stereotypes to reach their goals in science. Certainly things have gotten better, but biases and barriers still exist, and we all have a role in getting rid of them. Lesson 2 is the critically important role we all can play in helping ignite the scientific minds of the future. Things are so stacked against kids today. When I was growing up, we all were free-range kids, and there was no admission fee at the zoo or the museum. Today, can you imagine dropping kids off at the zoo or nature center to explore on their own? You'd surely get arrested. And when was the last time you went to a free zoo or museum? So whether you have your own kids or younger siblings or nephews and nieces or grandkids or neighbor kids, your friends' kids, whoever, please get them outdoors, get them into nature, to zoos and aquariums, natural history museums, all the places where their curiosity can be fired up and their imagination run wild. I really, really thank you for this opportunity and for your attention and for honoring me with this chance to share some thoughts and experiences with you. Thank you. And if there's any questions, discussion, I'd love to engage in that.
Thanks, Winnie. That was phenomenal. I so appreciate your time and sharing with us today.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm trying to bring people up here. How do I